Welcome to the SOB radio show, where we have fun, interesting guests, and hot topics. Each week, we offer insights into music, fashion, health, fitness, and humor. Do you have the perfect guest for us to interview? I want to know. Drop me a line on our Facebook page at Spunky Old Broad 1 or reach out to me on our website at spunkyoldbroad.com. And now, back to the show.
Hi, everybody. This is Gail Carson back with Grace Sammon, who is my guest today, who is an entrepreneur, an educator, a speaker, an author, and a storyteller. And we've been talking about some of the things and parts of Grace's life and what she's been through and the things that she's had to deal with. So I guess, I would ask you, you do a lot of volunteer work, you said. What kind of work do you most like, and what do you support? I do a lot of mentoring for women, and that's what I do, and I like it very much because I hope I'm contributing in some way. But what are the things that you like to do?
Oh, I think volunteering is so important, and I've done a lot of mentoring myself. I'm actually beginning to think of creating an author resource network because this whole learning curve of being an author is so different than I could have ever anticipated. We talked in the earlier segment about social media, but there's such a steep learning curve that I want to be able to give back to new authors, kind of a jump start or a leg up. So that's something I'm just beginning to create. In my other volunteer work, where my real passions are in two areas. One is called the Guardian Ad Litem Network, which is what it's called here in the state of Florida. In other states, it's called a CASA, a CASA, a court-appointed special advocate. And we are people who support kids who are either neglected, abused, or abandoned. And so usually kids in the foster care family. And we are their advocate in courts. We are their advocates in schools. And the way that we abuse children in this country is horrific. And even with all of my work in inner city schools in 32 states, sometimes I think I'm going to leave my best legacy in the lives of those children. And the other piece of work that I love is in hospice work, walking those final months with families and people and listening to their stories. I have a tagline in my book that says, when our stories are told, everything changes. And walking those journeys are really profound for me.
Well, that's very interesting that you mentioned those particular organizations, because I'm familiar with the Guardian Ad Litem program, because I got custody of my husband and I got custody of my granddaughter when she was about 12. And we didn't have her for long, but we had her for long enough. And of course, we dealt with the Guardian Ad Litem program. And I'm happy to say that all the other things that are available to children, in other words, the grants, the scholarships, the financial aid, turned this young woman who never even graduated high school, who then eventually got her GED and has now got her master's degree, is a teacher and in charge of the special needs program of the county where she is, and is so successful as a teacher that it's amazing. I mean, she's turned out to be this wonderful young woman. But I think it all has to do with everything that she was able to take advantage of, going through all of these different things. And of course, hospice, I don't know how anybody does hospice. I mean, it's a magnificent program. And I did have hospice as I was an executor of my best friend's estate, and she was in hospice in her last term. And what a difference it makes. So I congratulate you for those particular organizations. But, this is the SOB show. So do you consider yourself an SOB? And everybody says, what is an SOB? And when I say spunky old broad, they say, well, and they say, well, I don't want to be considered old, and I don't want to be called a broad. And I say, well, that's not you. But for me, an SOB is someone who is spunky, open, and brave. So do you consider yourself an SOB?
It's funny, Gail, when I got the invitation to be on your show, I thought, oh my God, spunky old broad, I don't know. And as I explored your world, I'm proud to be a spunky old broad. And as I mentioned in the earlier segment in my novel, The Eves, there is this group of older women, and they are not done. They are spunky, they are diverse, they are determined, they're sometimes ditzy. But when I get a reader who says, I want to take my place with the women in your book, I think, oh my gosh, yes. And I am honored to be in the company of the original spunky old broad. So, yes, I want to live out my days as an SOB.
Wonderful. Well, you just mentioned that, you have all these people who read your book and say, yeah, this is me, or I want to be part of this. But your characters tell the story of people never being done. So do you think that there's a certain characteristic that people have that allow them to never be done, or are there people who just kind of give up?
Oh, I think there are both kind of people, and I can't judge either group. Maybe it's the gift of genetics, or it's the gift of brain chemistry, or it's the gift of privilege. I don't know. I would hope each of us could find in ourselves and with the support of friends the ability to not give up. Your focus is so strong on women, and the research shows that men live longer if they are married. Women live longer and report more meaningful lives if they have a good friend network. And I think that that's a way to begin if you're stuck. And I never like to give advice to anybody. But if you're stuck, find places where you can build friendships and where you can put your talents, whether it's towards the volunteering that we just mentioned, but find those things that give you joy every day. And even in the midst of some really difficult times. We talked earlier about, me losing my job when I was very, very young. I think I was 35 the day I got divorced. And then years later, I created yet another nonprofit and thought that's where I was going to spend my happily ever aftering. And my business partner deserted the partnership. I didn't know what to do. And I had to reinvent myself yet again. It wasn't what I wanted to do. Again, it was that necessity of a mother of invention. And I thought it was horrible, but that's what propelled me to write my first book. My first book was on education in high schools. And that book was the ticket to national public speaking. I never thought of myself as a keynote speaker at a conference. That's something somebody else did. So that book was my ticket to conferences across this country and being a keynote. And then that led to contracts in school systems. And then that led to listening to stories. And some of those stories are interwoven in my novel because I'm a good listener.
It's interesting that you talk about, one thing leading to another, because it is so true that you never know where opportunity is going to knock. And if you're out there doing, and whatever you're doing well, opportunity does knock, and people do see you, and they do come up with ideas, and then those ideas are taken by you and even expanded further. So there's so many things that you've just said that are so important, and it's true. So it's interesting how one thing leads to another. And you talk about, the word pivot, which people are beginning to hate at this point. But in today's business parlance, people are using pivoting a lot. And there are moments when there is a shift and you have to pivot to get to success. So you just mentioned some of the times that this has happened to you. What's going on now for you?
I think two things. One is that idea of wanting to start this new authors group to use my talents differently. The other part, and I'm in the beginning to hate the word pivot camp, by the way. It's a little overused. It's like back in the day, you'll probably remember the book Who Moved My Cheese?
Right,
And
exactly.
oh my gosh, if I had to sit through one more professional development where we were reading the book Who Moved My Cheese, and we would all talk about that. So for me, that's pivoting is the new cheese. But the pivot for me right now is I do have another story in me, and I am getting sucked up into social media world. And for me, the secret of my life and having gone through multiple things, whether it was a divorce or business shifts or just the normal, I'm not the mom of my kids anymore because they're adults. Um, for me, it's that trying to strike balance has always brought me peace and joy. And right now, I'll be very candid. I'm not in balance. I'm sucked up in the social media world, which I'm enjoying, but it's not giving me the place to write my next book. And Maya Angelou has a phrase, a quote that says, the worst agony for a writer is a story that's inside that hasn't yet been told. And I'm feeling this tension that I have to figure out of how to stay present in the publishing world. Because as you know so well with your coaching and your mentoring and how you help people in this world, it can be a full-time job. So for me, that reinvention now or that pivot now has to be kind of a step back to get back into some of my writing roots where I have the joy of researching, where I have the joy of not be thinking about social media when I'm sitting across the dinner table from my husband.
It's interesting that you talk about all of this with the writing and the social media and so forth. Your first book was very based on education, and this last book, The Eves, I mean, is so totally different. What shifted in you that you were able to make this transition, and you became more of a storyteller than kind of reporting data?
Mhm. I think that even in my educational works, I tried to weave the stories of the educators into it because data can be pretty dry. I also have my bachelor's degree is in drama and psychology, so I like the telling of stories. The shift, I think, really came from how I've always approached my life was in writing, whether it was keeping a diary as an angst-filled teenager or whether it was telling the stories of the educators. So the shift is certainly a professional shift from knowing the educational published world to knowing the fiction published world, so fiction and nonfiction. Those worlds are very different, but I don't know that the process of the writing is that different. It's much harder to get a novel published, which was a surprise to me. You would think that a data filled book, which has to evoke change in school systems nationwide, would need to be much more difficult to get published. I sent out 14 proposals and 11 professional houses wanted my book. The world of a novel is painfully different.
It's interesting that you mentioned that because when you first started out and when you first did your first book, the publishing industry was totally different too. I remember my first book was published by, I think it was Bantam. I don't even remember, but it was everywhere. I mean, I got a lot of speaking contracts because when I went to Indonesia, my book was in the bookstore there, and then the oil companies hired me because my book was in the bookstore there, and Singapore, the same thing, and so forth and so on. But today, and of course, self-publishing was like a no-no, but today, self-publishing is, I would say, almost as legitimate as the established publishers, and in some ways, even more effective because, number one, an author can finally make money when they have a self-published book, although a book is often a big business card as well. It's not just a book. And the second part of that is the fact that it can be done quicker and they have control because in a publishing house, they can change your title. They can change a lot of things. So what is your What is your take on the publishing versus, the legitimate publisher, let's say, versus the self-publisher?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question because even the language around that has changed, and my language around that has changed. I used to call it real or legitimate publishing and self publishing. Now the language is very much changing to traditional and independent publishing. And just, I'm a lover of words, and I am sometimes criticized for my focus on using specific words, but I love that shift between real and traditional to, traditional is going to one of those big houses, going to Bantam, going to Penguin, going to Harlequin, going to wherever your genre would lead you, and to the world of indie publishing. I agree with you that authors have a much more legitimate voice now in that world of indie publishing. Nobody ever asks me who my publisher is. And the world is so different that, Amazon now has, I think it's 5 presses within the Amazon family. It used to just be the Kindle Direct Publishing (KDP), but now I think it may have more. It has 5 houses that it puts their imprimatur on, and it looks as traditional or as real as the old school days, if you will. I think what listeners would be surprised at is whether you're an indie publisher or a traditional publisher, it is still expected that you will do minimally, I would say, 2 hours a day on social media. That you will have multiple handles, multiple platforms, that you will tweet, you will LinkedIn, that you will do podcasts, that you will do a newsletter. There's no more the huge support of the back of the house, I don't think, even in the most traditional houses, unless you're, the big, big names.
Well, that's true. I think, one of the things that I know that authors always told me was that, unless you had a marketing plan along with your proposal, your book proposal, that it was very hard to get a contract. So marketing is very important. And for those people who are listening who might say, well, I've always wanted to write a book, or I have written a book, you can't just write a book and let it stay there. I mean, people won't know that it's there. I mean, I don't know what the number is now. It's some amazing amount of books that are published every single week. So there are, there's a lot of competition out there. However, it's also a sign of legitimacy. So the fact that you have sat down and written a book, whether anyone knows about it or not, is very, very important, because it shows that you spent the time and energy and effort to make your opinions or philosophy or point of view known. But the point is that it does take a marketing plan to make your particular book, whatever it is, whether it's a novel or whether it's a how-to or whatever it is, to make it known outside of your own sphere of influence, let's say. So I'm glad to hear that. And, if you do start your author referral or author whatever you're going to be doing, I have so many authors that I interview and that I've come in contact with. I certainly can be a big referral source for you. So I'm glad to hear that you talk about it being much more, and I'm going to use the word legitimate now, to be an independent publisher versus a traditional. And frankly, there are very few traditional houses left. I mean, they've either been combined or gone out of business or whatever, because the whole world of publishing has changed. Now, I'm still a person who likes to hold a book in my hand. I do not like to read things on screen. And when people send me a PDF or they send me a Kindle or they send me, I'm not one, it just takes me forever to read it. But when I've got a book in my hand, I can sit, I can peruse, I can read. So I am one of those people that still like to have a book in my hand. So we've talked about legacy and we've talked about, so forth. How do you want to see your mark left on the world? And How do you think that all of this that we've talked about, how do they all connect?
Oh, it's that issue of the dash between the date of our birth and the date of our death. I have very few needs at this point. I'm very lucky. Um, I, and I think that maybe being a satisfied person is an incredibly lucky thing for me. The legacy I would want to leave is one of kindness. I'm frequently asked, if you had the opportunity to say something, what would it be? And my answer is always be kinder than you need to be. And I try to live my life that way. In my novel, The Eves, the main character, Jessica, as we've talked about, is horribly lost. And she is so broken that as she learns these life lessons from these older women, she actually writes them down. And they're things like, first do no harm, be kinder than you need to be, listen more than you speak. Um, it's interesting. In the back of the book there's a book club discussion, which many books have, but there's also just questions, kind of life questions. What are the best three things of your childhood? What were the hardest things of your childhood? So when you ask me what I want my legacy to be, I would like it that I'm kinder than I need to be, that I first seek to understand, that I listen, and that other people who come in contact with me maybe share some of that with others. I love the idea of paying it forward too. That was a great movie. Um, how do we do well in the world so that, when we are gone and someone says our name, they smile, and somehow then we are still alive.
That's terrific. That's terrific. Well, we're coming to the end of the show, so I want people to know, how can they reach you, Grace? I don't know if you have a gift for anybody. What is the best way to get in touch with you, and what would you like our listeners to know about you, and where to find you, and so forth?
Well, thanks, Gail. And I have so enjoyed our time together, and I'm going to continue to follow my new best friend, Spunky Old Broad. And your listeners can find me at gracesammon.net. And salmon is said like the fish, but spelled Sammon. So gracesammon.net. They can email me at gracesammon.net. And if they have questions about being an author or anything else, I'm happy to give them whatever my little window on this world can be. I love connecting with readers. If they are part of a book club and would want me to Zoom to their book club, I'm happy to do that. If they're a podcaster, it's one of my favorite things to do. So please feel free to reach out. You can follow me on Facebook at Grace Sammon Writes, as in Writes Books, Writes. You can find me there on Instagram as well. So please feel free to reach out. We hadn't talked about a giveaway, but I would say I would be happy to send 2 books to the first 2 people who email me, and I would be delighted to do that. All they have to do is send me an email at gracesammon.net and send me their address, and I'll pop a book in the mail.
Fantastic. Well, you have been a delight to interview, Grace, and I'm glad that you're still doing all your magnificent things and that you've got all these other things planned for the future, because that's a part of continuing that SOB legacy, And the other part of it is talking about kindness. One of the things that I do, and especially in my Facebook Lives and also in things that I write, is to pay it forward. There's so much grief going on in the world. If you can pay it forward, if you can pay something forward that's good and kind and nice and valuable, that's going to make that person's day, if not life, but their day better. And it's going to make them smile. And that's all a part of, what we're about. So I'm going to encourage you to be in touch with Grace. I hope some of you will go to Spunky Old Broad on YouTube and subscribe. I hope that you'll go to my website, which is spunkyoldbroad.com, find my programs, find my store, find my newsletter, find my other shows that I do, and take a part of all of that, because we want to create this movement on and in the world of doing for others and doing better for others. So thank you, Grace, for being with us today. It's been absolutely delightful, and best wishes for you in the future. And I will look forward to staying in touch with you.
Thank you, Gail, and you as well.